So glad all of you. Oh, and we are recording. Aisha remembered already. We're rolling. So welcome to Postvention 101. Before we start, I do want to thank Aisha because as director of the training initiatives, she has done so much awesome work, and it's always a pleasure to interact with her. But more importantly, she is such a great babysitter, and she always helps me with my tech issues. And so that inevitably happens on every training or presentation I do. Now, one thing I have learned is that successful trainings, especially when done remotely, really require a couple key elements. First and foremost, please be interactive. You don't want to listen to me blabber on for 2 hours straight. That gets really boring for everyone. And I love hearing from you because that's what makes this whole thing work. Please keep your phones on silence unless you have something to add, as Aisha said. I like having cameras on just because I like to see who you are, because otherwise I feel like I'm talking to myself and I hear the voices in my head plenty on my own. Do you understand that go ahead. And this is why we mess with the mute buttons. Given my history of technical issues, do I need to, is my screen looking good, or I've got messages popping up? Okay. I never know what you guys see, what I see. I always have tech issues. It happens in every presentation. If something goes weird or my screen goes black or you can't hear me, don't freak out. It happens. We'll work through it. So now that we've covered all those housekeeping things, let's jump on into this. If I can get, yeah, see the first tech issue. All right. So the reason we're talking about postvention, interesting that I literally got a phone call 3 days ago from my father of all people. And he's like, hey, Bill, so this group that I'm associated with, one of their leaders just had a stepson who died by suicide. What kind of information or what do we do? I think that really kind of reiterated to me how important this discussion is this afternoon. Postvention is something that's not often thought about or discussed. And we're going to spend the next 2 hours talking about it, learning about it, and hopefully it's a good interactive experience. And as we do this, let me introduce you to me. That's me, William Bill Schmitz, Jr. You have my email. The reason I include my email early on, you have access to this presentation. I know I do my presentations through Prezi. If in the future you want to have access to it, just shoot me an email. I'll send you the link. The reason I do that is I don't want you to worry about taking notes or anything like that. It's more important for you to be interactive and hopefully listen to the words coming out of my mouth and interacting with the chat box over in the window, because that's where the learning takes place. So I am more than just a name and an email. So what do I do? Well, my real job, or my day job, is I'm a clinical psychologist with the Department of Veterans Affairs. I've been working there for about 17 years. And I do all the psychologist-y things. I do individual therapy and group therapy. I do some assessments. And of course, I fill in a variety of administrative boring roles too. On top of that, I spent over 10 years on the board of directors of the American Association of Suicidology, which you see on the screen in front of you. AAS is the only national membership organization dedicated to the prevention, intervention, and postvention of suicide. It was formed in 1968. The highlight of my time serving the organization was certainly my 2-year presidency from 2013 to 2015. And I have very happily stepped away from the organization a little bit because it's run by a whole bunch of other great people like Dr. April Foreman and other names that you're familiar with, because I know they like hanging out in Florida with y'all. On top of that, I also am currently wrapping up my 3rd year on the board of directors with the Baton Rouge Crisis Intervention Center, and they serve as the home to the National Suicidology Training Center. This allows me to train providers and others on various matters related to working with suicidal individuals and those impacted by suicide. One of the latest endeavors that I've been working with is detective and psychologist Jeff Thompson out of the NYPD, doing the credentialed American Association of Suicidology Law Enforcement Psychological Autopsy trainings. So that's a fun side endeavor. And then the fourth hat I wear is that of forensic suicidologist, and I've been doing that for about 9 years. And that's an exciting role where a lot of people think most of my time is spent doing what's in this picture, but the vast majority of it is really doing nothing more than staring at a bunch of papers and trying to figure out what the heck happened. So that's a little bit about me and what I do. You guys have done a great job letting us know where you're from and what you're doing. Hopefully you make lots of great connections through this training. That's what this is all about. So let's move on. Now that you know a little about me, how many of you are familiar with this term, postvention? This is where you get to interact. We like lots of interaction. So wave, just type an X or something in the chat box so we know that you are in fact alive and haven't fallen asleep yet. I see one wave. You guys are really hurting me. I also only have like a couple of you on the screen thing, so I don't know if everyone has zonked out.
No, they're here. I see it.
Okay, good.
You're not familiar.
As long as they're waving at you, that's the important part.
No, I see them in the chat box.
I love it. All right. And it looks like a couple of you are not familiar with the term, so that's great. Hopefully this is really educational. So,
I'm taking this off, sorry.
Postvention is essentially the third component to the suicide response triad. Most of you are probably familiar with suicide prevention, and those are activities that we enact to stop the formation of a problem, in this case, suicidality. And then there's intervention, where it's the intervening in a problem to thwart an unwanted outcome, which in this case is a suicide death. And then there's postvention, and we don't talk as much about postvention because it's the often overlooked and less frequently discussed arm of this triad. And to examine this postvention, I need to introduce you to one of my heroes, and that is none other than the father of suicidology, Dr. Edwin Shneidman. One of the many cool things and interesting facts about Shneidman is that he had a love for neologisms. He created a lot of words. In fact, it was Shneidman who actually coined the term suicidology. But that wasn't the only term he came up with, because he was a wordsmith and he loved it. So back in 1971, Shneidman wrote the following, and he said, postvention is to come after. That is, to do those things after the dire event has occurred that either A, serve to mollify the after effects of the event in the chief protagonist, specifically to work with a person after he has attempted suicide, or B, deal with the inimical's a great word, sequels in other persons affected by the event. For example, the family members of a severely distressed person, or in the case of a committed suicide, with the obvious mental health needs of the survivor victims. I prefer postvention. So you can tell that Shneidman was not at all familiar with Twitter, certainly could not limit himself to any kind of character limit, but he really came up with this profound and novel way of thinking about the after of a suicide attempt. And then 50 years later, where we're at today, the definition of postvention has not changed all that dramatically, though hopefully it's a little bit clearer than Schneidman's prototypically effusive prose. Had to say that because it sounded Schneidman-y. But here's where we're at. Suicide postvention provides organized, immediate, as well as ongoing support following a suicide death. It promotes healing after suicide loss and, in turn, reduces suicide for those impacted. So at least now, hopefully, you're familiar with what this whole postvention thing is. And for a few minutes, we're actually going to shift gears a little bit and talk about suicide in general. And this is going to entail a little bit of time travel. So as we shoot back in time, obviously we have to remember that suicide is not new. It's been around for quite a while. And that being said, how suicide is viewed by one society or culture has certainly varied over time. As such, there are some lessons to be learned from this quick trip back into history. And so we could go back to ancient times. Is anyone familiar with this individual? See, more of that interactive stuff. Three, hopefully you're getting a text or two. If not, we will hope that people wake up.
I am checking the chat box. If anybody wants to put in the chat box, if they're familiar with the image, or they can.
All right.
Who it is. And I'm seeing.
No idea.
No
That's
idea.
what I like to hear. All right. Thanks, Jenny. So this is Ajax, Greek mythological character, impaling himself on his sword. So what can we learn from history? I mean, we know the world of Greeks and Romans are often viewed as societies that permitted and even glorified suicide. However, there's no evidence that suicide was in fact common, and most historians that I'm familiar with and have interacted with have concluded that suicides, while certainly present at the time, were rather infrequent. When we jump ahead to kind of biblical periods, we find that the Bible, in fact, includes 7 suicides. The Bible does not really condone those deaths. And in some of the Old Testament cases, the suicide is pretty much reported without any apparent misgivings. You can think about Samson, Saul, and others. If you have any questions on this stuff, email me afterwards. You may notice I talk pretty quickly. That's because I'm trying to pack a whole bunch of stuff into this very short window of time. So if you miss something, email me a question, do whatever, we'll get caught up. All right. Now, early suicides, we're talking around the 4th century at this point as we kind of move forward in time, were often viewed by the church, which was the primary source of authority, as a reflection of martyrdom. And by proxy, it would lend the decedent a pathway to heaven. If that was a way to get into heaven, guess what happened with the suicide rate around that time? Things started to go up. So things changed a little bit in the Middle Ages when Thomas Aquinas, that may be a name you're familiar with, wrote that self-killing is the most fatal of all sins because it cannot be repented of. So the church changed its views, and now with the church viewing self-killing as the ultimate mortal sin, the church now denied to suicides a decent burial, meaning that they couldn't be buried in holy ground, a churchyard, and instead were really equated to what has been termed a dog's burial. The secular authorities, who worked very closely and directly with the church, followed the directives of the church and sought to profit from this proclamation. As such, English law declared a self-killer as a felo de se, which is medieval Latin for suicide, unless in a case of insanity was made, and that the person, decedent and estate, was automatically liable to the confiscation of property. And by the time we arrive in the 16th, 17th centuries, there's still some questioning of what happened to a suicide decedent's soul, as human dualism was starting to take hold, looking at humans as having both a body and a soul. And so given this changing worldview, the authorities were not going to take any chances with the bodies of these decedents. So from the Middle Ages until about the 18th century, it wasn't uncommon for the corpses of suicide decedents to be dragged through the streets and hanged on the gallows or on a 2-pronged trunk. Once the body had decayed, then it was to be buried outside the churchyard, in ways inverted to normal practice. Also, not uncommon for a pole to be driven through the body, thereby preventing the self-murderer from raising from the grave, hampering their attempts to get to heaven. There are some additional persecution of suicide descendants that are included in history, such as, the burying of dead as far from crops or bodies of water as possible. And that was done in an effort to make sure as to not taint or desecrate those resources. In other situations, we saw that bodies would be removed from homes via the windows and not through the doorway, so as not to make that to confuse the body in a lot of cases. So lots of interesting things in older times, but in some cultures, particularly in, say, the UK, suicide decedents were buried at crossroads, intersections. And this was done to confuse the spirit and was often held there, once again, by a stake. In fact, up to 1823, which is not all that long ago, burials in the UK at crossroads took place for both suicides and executed criminals. Now, part of the reason for this was really pretty practical. No one wanted to pay for burying either of these groups of people. And since the crossroads marked land that belonged to no one, what better place to bury people denied a Christian burial? So, and it had the added bonus of hopefully believing that the soul would be more likely to get confused, lost, or disoriented if they came back out of the grave. So, in summary, we see a pretty extensive history of suicide being considered criminal behavior. This is part of the reason that the term commit suicide is no longer considered appropriate. And I know that we saw that just a few slides earlier in Shneidman's definition. And so we see how this has changed over time. But a lot of it is in reaction to this old school criminalization of suicidology and suicide. So for many people impacted by suicide, the common connotation of commit, as in committed suicide, keeps suicide linked to this sense of criminality. Now, it wasn't until the early age of enlightenment when there was kind of this marked shifting away from the condemnation of suicide toward a desire to understand suicide. There was a growing movement in the 19th century within the medical community, and eventually taken over by psychiatry, that looked at suicide decedents not as criminals, but as sufferers. Initial medical explanations were pretty organic, such as, a thick skull bone or the presence of black bile in the body. But generally speaking, the medicalization of suicide explained the state as due to insanity and, by proxy, in need of institutionalization and hospitalization. So the reason for this little divergence into history is to underscore that suicide is a significant, long-standing issue. And that being said, it's a problem that's continued to grow and become more common, particularly in this time and in this country. Any questions on our trip through memory lane and way back in time? I'm only going to pause for a moment. I at least saw one or two heads shake no. That means I get to jump forward. So every presentation I seem to attend has a bunch of what I call number slides. And generally these slides are used to highlight how important whatever the research is or anything. So this is where my number slides come in. And you may notice I drink a lot of fluids because my allergies are kicking my tail this week. So I apologize for that. Now, you may be familiar with some of these figures, but the most recent figures that we have currently in the United States are from 2019, and we're losing, on average, 130 individuals a day. 102 of those are male, 28 female, and at that time, it was the 10th leading cause of death. In fact, it's been the 10th leading cause of death since 2008. So it's not an uncommon death. But we must remember that these numbers do not occur in a vacuum. For every suicide, somebody has died. And with every death, there are people left behind. This leaves a wake or a void in the form of those left behind. So when you think about suicide, who might be impacted by a suicide? And this is where I'm really counting on you guys to dump information into the chat box. This is the interactive portion of the show. So who is impacted by a suicide? Loved ones, family members, friends, everyone who knew that person, educators, community. You guys knew it's much broader. Good job. All right. And as you're about to see, you've already said many of these children, certainly. We have family, parents, siblings, spouses, children, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins. Family can be a lot of different people. You can look at the work or school community that the person was interactive with. This may include peers, colleagues, supervisors, subordinates, team members, teachers. What about one's faith community? And we can also think about a number of other groups. And these could be groups that the suicide decedent was a part of, such as sports teams or outreach or community service organizations. I saw someone put that up, Channing. You know, maybe they have a hobby and they were part of a group that was, you know, kind of meeting around that. So it's far more than just the family. So obviously these suicides do not occur in a vacuum. So how many people do you think are impacted by a suicide? That was my dramatic pause, and it didn't get a single text response. So how many of you have maybe seen this figure? That for every suicide, there are 6 people who are impacted. This figure 6 really had been rather consistently cited, dating way back to the 1980s up until at least 2010. And the origin of this figure is somewhat obfuscated. It appears, based on people I've talked to, that the number was reported initially by none other than Dr. Edwin Shneidman, who you met earlier. And it was in a setting where, as part of an insurance settlement, he was asked how many lives were ruptured by a suicide. And he, after a bit of reflection, said 6. And that number 6 just kind of rolled forward, and we used it in all sorts of materials and everything for a good 3 decades. And it was just kind of an accepted figure. But no one had really stepped up to examine the accuracy of that number or really explore the validity of it. But when we think about kind of the number of people who are impacted by a suicide, we really need to figure out and consider what is a survivor? What constitutes a survivor? And this is a good, valid question. But until 2014, it really had not been addressed by the suicidologists and the scientists and the epidemiologists. So in 2014, Dr. Julie Searle and some of her colleagues looked at definitional challenges related to this whole survivorship terminology matter. And what they proposed is that the pool of people left behind in the wake of a suicide is far larger than what had been typically considered to be a survivor, using that old, outdated, rather randomly selected number 6. So Dr. Julie Searle, John McIntosh, and their group in 2014 published the Continuum of Survivorship, Definitional Issues in the Aftermath of Suicide. And this really helped shape how we think about those who are impacted by a suicide, going much further than the stock survivor label. In fact, they came up with 4 different groups of people that were impacted by a suicide. This outer group, the black circle in this figure, is those who are suicide exposed. And this is everyone who has had any connection to the deceased or to the death itself. That may include witnesses. It could include just passersby. The second group is the suicide affected. And this group is the people for whom the experience carries a reaction, but that reaction may be mild, moderate, or severe, self-limiting, or ongoing. And as we get closer to the center of that circle, we see the suicide bereaved short term. And these people are those who have an attachment bond with the deceased and gradually adapt to the loss over time. We can think of these as people who had been significantly impacted and were bereaved by the death, but were able to, in a typical period of time, able to stabilize and move forward. And then the smaller circle, the inner circle, is suicide bereaved long-term. And these are those for whom grieving becomes really a protracted struggle that includes diminished functioning in important areas and aspects of their lives. And these are people who are really impacted by the suicide long-term. This group is significantly impacted over time, many years. So it's very much a broader group than the old dichotomy of survivor, non-survivor. Now this research, oh, is there a question? Or we're just randomly hitting mute, unmute. That happens sometimes too. Been there, done that. I hit lots of wrong keys. So this research demonstrated what we had really long suspected, in that the impact of a suicide loss extends far and wide, and anyone can be affected regardless of their relationship to the person who died. This means that many people in your life, such as your neighbor, coworker, hairdresser, friend, gym instructor, uncle-in-law, former classmate, maybe the coffee shop barista, have been touched by suicide. In fact, in 2017, Dr. Bill Fiegelman wrote that while there is not yet definitive evidence for the number of survivors, the exposed group, that large outer circle, might include as many as 40 to 50% of the entire population of the United States. And so when you look at Fiegelman's work and the work of Dr. Julie Searle and John McIntosh, there's really kind of this growing impetus to better understand what constitutes this survivorship work. And as part of that, let me introduce you to Dr. Julie Searle. She's a psychologist who's awesome and hangs out over at the University of Kentucky. And in 2019, she and her group used data from a random digit dial survey to really try and obtain a more accurate number of people exposed to each suicide. And the results indicated that each suicide resulted in about 135 people being exposed. That means 135 people that knew the person. Now, we talked about how there's those 4 different areas or kind of degrees of connection. And we know that each suicide affects a large circle of people who may be in need of clinical services or support following that exposure. However, how many people fall into that inner circle, that suicide bereaved long term? Well, due to the sample size that Cyril and colleagues had, what they were able to discern was that that number in that inner circle is somewhere between 6 and 25. And that's a pretty broad range, but when you think about trying to capture that kind of data, it's hard to get, because suicide's a low base rate event, it's very difficult to get more specific data. But I think they did a really nice job of helping us understand that there's far more than 6. And to have at least that large window or range between 6 and 25 really helps us understand that those long-term bereaved is a really much more significant group than 6 per any suicide. So now we know, and we have data to support, that each suicide affects a large circle of people who may be in need of clinical services or support following an exposure to a suicide death. Any questions on all these great, fascinating number slides? Everyone loves talking about numbers, especially my accountant, except he always says my numbers are red for some reason. Really, no questions yet? You guys are killing me.
You're just
I am far
so
more.
good. You're
No, if I were more engaging, you wanting to type more.
No, you're just explaining everything so well. Like, just taking it in.
I'm glad we're soaking it in and basking in this great knowledge dump. All right, so now I gotta get back to making this stuff move forward. All right, so from a postvention perspective, we definitely want to be reaching out to the inner circle of that group, the long-term bereaved, but we should also be aware of the potential needs of those in the short-term bereaved and those who are affected, those outer layers of that continuum. And now that we've kind of covered all the numbers and we've been through the history stuff, see. So now that we've been through that stuff, let's talk a little bit about the impact that suicide has on those left behind. Because it's important to look at the consequences and the ramifications and the fallout from a suicide. I've been really struck in my work with those bereaved by suicide, and the descriptors they use for their experience is often far more eloquent and powerful than anything I could say. And this is actually taken from a UK resource, so you'll catch a little bit of British language in here, but this is how one person described their experience. My experience of suicide is that it is the equivalent of a bomb going off in your living room while you're watching telly. Afterwards, you're astonished you're alive, but everything has changed, and you have a million shards of glass embedded in your soul. Some of them are so big, they fall out straight away, leaving gaping wounds. But the little pieces, they can take decades to work their way up to the surface. That's a really powerful image for me. And so that's something I really want to convey to you, is we can talk about all these big numbers, and we can talk about suicide being a 10th leading cause of death. But it's such a major life event for those left behind. And so when we look at what survivors might experience, there's a number of different things that may be part of their death experience, and they're incorporated on this list. They may have witnessed the suicide. They may have discovered the body. I've worked with several people who That's been a really big part of their healing, is trying to come to terms with that. Remembering that they may be kept from the body by law enforcement or by family, may be unable to view the body due to destruction or other reasons, which can then make it harder to obtain closure. They may have attempted life support or rescue and it failed. They may be involved or were involved in cleanup after the suicide. They may have experienced injury or near miss as part of that death. And I'm not going to read all of these to you, but hopefully you see that there are some really atypical and suicide specific and traumatic specific experiences that our suicide survivors may be experiencing. So given that that may be their experience, what might their reactions and issues be? Well, typical or reported issues in the aftermath of a suicide are pretty well incorporated here. Shock, disbelief, feelings of isolation, memory loss, inability to work, compulsive behaviors. We're looking at things like overeating, excessive shopping, drugs, alcohol. The feeling isolated, I do like to talk about for a second, because it's not just a feeling or being isolated. It may be feeling isolated and alone, even in large crowds or when around other people. It's a very common experience. We look at wishing one were dead, not an uncommon one. And for a lot of people, they may be having an urge to join the deceased. So we want to keep that in mind as part of the natural or common reactions. The PTSD-like symptoms definitely depends on the relationship to the decedent, but especially if I witnessed a suicide or was part of the cleanup or had to see the scene, all those things can lead to some intrusive memories and things like that. So when we look at the research findings, as I mess around with my computer screen, we see a couple things in the impact of suicide loss. We know that partners bereaved by suicide have an increased risk of suicide. Parents bereaved by the suicide of a child, and this is actually regardless of the child's age at the time of death. To require a psychiatric admission. Can you still hear me all right? I somehow managed to get a phone call in the middle of this. I'm so glad I told everyone to turn their phones off, and then my phone goes off. Way to lead by example. All right.
Good, thank you.
Mothers bereaved by an adult's child suicide were at increased risk of their own suicide. These are all different research studies, obviously, and there's a bunch more. I've really just tried to whittle down some to highlight what I want you to understand. So that being said, and the last one, offspring. So all these are pretty much family relations. But we've got to remember that perception is reality. And so
Dr. Schmitz, we lost you.
sorry about that.
Okay.
The joys of parenthood. You just never know when your phone's going to blow up and what's going on.
All right, you're back.
But perceptions of closeness to the decedent and not the actual kinship relationship increase the odds of depression and anxiety, and almost quadrupled the odds of PTSD in a study which also found suicide exposed individuals to be more likely than suicide unexposed individuals to report their own suicidal ideations. Perception is reality. I think that's something that you'll hear me mention a couple times today because it's so important. Back when I was training and getting my doctorate in psychology. I know we were always taught to ask people if they'd ever had a family member die by suicide, right? And that's important information, especially when you look at, case examples like the Hemingway family and things like that. That being said, if my uncle who lives in Vermont and who I've never met died by suicide, it may not have had much of an impact on me. Whereas maybe my best friend in high school or my partner's sister, if either of those losses occurred, those may have a major impact on me. So I've really worked with people to change the framing of that question on, has suicide impacted your family too? Has your life been impacted by suicide? It really broadens that out much nicer. And we really want to encapsulate all these different positions and roles and titles, because we know that suicide exposed group is so huge and we don't know where people fall on those continuums. We can look back on a 2020 study by Hill and colleagues, and they looked at 57 different controlled studies on suicide, bereavement exposure, and they found that, once again, the key component to, what was associated with negative health and social outcomes really was that individual's relationship with the deceased. So we talk about that connection, and it's a perceived connection. And, one thing we aren't going to talk a whole lot about today, but something to keep in mind. And we saw this, we do a better job around messaging now, but if I am really connected and I feel a really strong relationship and connection to a public figure, be it Kurt Cobain or Chris Connell, there's so many, Robin Williams amongst our older population. So glad I get to include myself in that older population. Oh, good Lord. But, if I really feel a strong connection and relationship to that person, obviously I don't have that connection, but it can still increase my risk if I have that personal connection feel. It's that perception. So we've talked about reactions, but obviously grief is a big issue. And personally, grief work is some of the hardest work I think you can do, because there's just not easy solutions. CBT doesn't work in 3 sessions and poof, you're good to go on the grief area. So we need to look at, what do those people who have been impacted by suicide report regarding their grief? And we see some common reactions and emotions: shock, disbelief, memory loss, compulsive behaviors, depression, spiritual struggles, and physical, mental exhaustion. I don't think we can understate that. And I think it's a much bigger, this is so far beyond fatigue. It really merits its own kind of specific targeting. Any questions on these common reactions? How many of you maybe can relate to some of these emotions and kind of this aftermath? It's another one of those great interactive portions where you guys go dead silent on me and then I talk to myself. Yes, Ricardo, thank you for jumping in.
I can talk from like my perspective while people are putting their experiences in the chat box. But I know, as someone who has worked in the field with individuals who've been affected by suicide, as well as like my personal experience and family experience, that anger, ooh, that anger it becomes invasive after a while, as if it doesn't give you the space sometimes for normal grief from a loss,
Hmm.
because the anger is so pervasive.
Yeah.
And I had a family friend who in the past year lost someone to suicide, and that was their primary state when it
Yeah.
was the shock and disbelief, but the anger just and I see in the chat box Rick is saying isolation is a common theme and pattern that he
Yeah. And so we really see all these different areas, and spiritual struggles come up for a lot of people, especially depending on what people's faith community response is. And that's something that is a key area that we're going to talk about in the postvention process as well. So in 2016, I believe it was, I'm fighting with my computer again a little bit. This is a great book. This is one of my favorite books on grief, postvention, and suicide. It's an edited volume by Jack Jordan and John McIntosh. And they concluded that suicide bereavement shares some universal elements of grief after any type of loss. And these are things like yearning for the deceased. But there's also elements of grief that are common to those after sudden unexpected losses, such as shock and disbelief. That's pretty consistent whether I lose someone to suicide or an unexpected car accident. And then there's elements in suicide bereavement and grief that are common after other sudden violent deaths, such as a homicide. And while there are a number of commonalities between the suicide bereavement process and these other deaths, there are some suicide specific elements of bereavement that are more prominent that we see after a suicide than most other types of death. And these include increased levels of guilt, stigmatization, perceived abandonment, and that's perceived abandonment by the deceased, anger, which Aisha really underscored nicely, and we're going to talk more about, and blaming, which can really rupture family dynamics or other social support networks significantly. Think about how that may impact a work community, for example, or a school community. Again, looking at a lot of that blaming. Now, some of you may be familiar with the grief work of Kubler-Ross. Any head nods or yeses out there? And while there really is, the empirical support for Kubler-Ross is awful, I do think it is a good heuristic, though. For a lot of people, I think it's got some heuristic value. For those of you not familiar with Kubler-Ross's stages of grief, which is a crock of crap, it's denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And so that's what the DABDA here is on that slide. Don't get me started on the research. I tend to fixate because it's just, the research is so bad trying to validate that. But like I said, I think those are some pretty common experiences. But on top of that, when we look at normal grief versus complicated grief and survivors of suicide experience the DABDA experiences, but there's also all these other additional experiences that are associated with the suicide loss. It can be guilt, embarrassment. Embarrassment is not something you commonly think about when you think about death. But yet, if I'm a parent and I've lost my child to suicide, There may be a sense of embarrassment. There's certainly rejection and shame, real and perceived. Again, going back to that, perception is reality. Even if people are not rejecting me, if I perceive rejection and shame, then that's still going to have a dramatic impact on how I'm carrying myself day to day. Isolation, again, coming up more and more. Existential angst is something that is being looked at more and more as we kind of think about the spiritual aspect of things. And, you know, you can look at, you know, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. There's a lot to how do we make sense of this life thing, and how can I integrate a suicide death into that? For many, there's a lot of self-reproach. There may be a sense of dishonor, disgrace. As you guys and gals look over this list, are there any in particular that you're surprised by or that don't make particular sense to you? All right, I'm going to fire myself if you guys don't get more interactive. I really try. Say again. All right, so are any of the experiences on this list surprising to you, or do any of them not make sense? I think the surprising piece is important, because hopefully as you look at them, you're going, oh, wow, I hadn't thought of that, but that makes sense. I like hearing kind of how some of these experiences really are perceived by you and what you take away as you look over this list of experiences.
So Kimberly says, I would say embarrassment is surprising.
Yeah. And hopefully I address that one, but a lot of it is, you know, and it may be embarrassment for the family. We can also think about this as embarrassment for the field. What if I'm a mental health professional and I just lost a colleague to suicide? You know, do I feel embarrassed as a mental health professional that we have suicides within our community? So I think embarrassment can pop up in a lot of kind of unexpected ways that when we look at really closely, we go, oh, wow, yeah, it does kind of make sense. Think about, we can also see a fair amount of embarrassment within the military culture, within units at very small levels. We can see this in law enforcement. I think it happens in faith communities. A lot of these tend to be kind of community. The erosion of trust in others. Very much so. Good answer.
I think when it comes to embarrassment too, it could be embarrassment at the method of suicide. To share personally, our family found out through the primetime news. So we found out at the same time the entire community found out.
Wow.
And unfortunately, it was live and they were filming and came upon the scene. So the embarrassment was twofold. It was that we weren't told before and we didn't have any preemption to prepare ourselves, but also that now everybody knew.
And then to be on display. Yeah.
Now
which I can only imagine jacked up that sense of shame.
Yes.
You know, so
And-
we
and
see
the
how
anger.
these, yeah.
Yeah. I think for me, working with individuals and families, one of the ones that was surprising for me to encounter as a clinician was the faulty beliefs about causation, because the way that movies always displayed it, the act was that there was always a note left behind to explain why. And then when you worked in the field, you realize there wasn't a note. If there was a note, I would be surprised. And so the faulty beliefs that people would come up with as to why this happened, and then asking the clinician why it happened and you not having an answer to give them.
Yeah. And, you know, when we think about those faulty beliefs, I think that's really important because for some, you mentioned the leaving behind of a note. Well, we know in most suicide deaths, there is no note. I think that's shocking to a lot of people who don't know about our work. But, especially working with kids, oh my gosh, the faulty beliefs around causation can be a huge stumbling block. And so there can be a lot of work to be done in those areas. But we all make faulty beliefs about causation, so we're all susceptible to it. And, the reality is we never truly know all of what another person's experience is. Great dialogue. See, this is so much better when you guys decide to interact. I'm a hell of a lot more entertaining that way too. Feel free to say yes or not. Are there differences in experiences between cultural? Definitely. I mean, that's why we spent a fair amount of time talking about the history, because you can just look at over time how kind of culture has shaped the way we in America view suicide and in different cultures. But there are certainly different experiences based on all those factors: age, culture, sexual orientation. Any subpopulation may have their own kind of reactions, values, beliefs related to suicide, and that's then going to trickle into what different experiences and emotions may follow in the aftermath of a suicide.
I agree, especially encountering some non-Western cultures that it's actually an honor amongst that culture that the person died by this way instead, and so it's so important that we're not expecting the same type of grief with every person, because some people may come into it glorifying the martyrdom
Mhm.
from their expectations of what suicide is from their cultural background.
And then how does that impact their interactions with others? So that can be really interesting.
That was
So
a good question, Kimberly.
definitely. So the reality is we have difficulty in making sense of that. That's a challenge. Difficulty just making sense of a suicide is just a really common, prominent part of the grief and bereavement process. A suicide may seem inexplicable and incomprehensible, the kind of the quintessential, they could have never done this. We hear that a fair amount of time. And suicide may entail a powerful rupturing of the mourner's assumptive world, including, we can never fully know another person. Boy, I thought I knew Tommy or Tammy or Tanya so well, or, another kind of common assumptive belief that a lot of people hold on to and want to hold on to is that, well, we can always keep those we love safe from harm. And so if this suicide really blows up that underlying assumption that I have held as a truth, it can really kind of lead to a lot of internal struggle and challenge. And there's another experience by some people that are impacted by suicide that really is very unique and bears noting. And that is the experience of relief. And we see this, and it's not completely uncommon among those bereaved, including, I'd mentioned the phone call earlier this week, and the person I ended up talking to was really kind of wrestling with this sense of, this sucks. It's blown up all these different areas of my life, but wow, there's also a part of me that's relieved, because there had been so much stress and anxiety and worry about the decedent. And so for some people, particularly when the deceased suffers from a severe mental illness, the death may not have been unexpected or seen as out of character. And these type of kind of feared suicides may elicit more prominent themes of helplessness and relief that the suffering is over. And then you kind of get a tinge of guilt for feeling that sense of relief. So I think it's an unusual kind of grief response that's unique to suicide, but within the suicide survivor group is not really uncommon. All right, so let's move on to how can we put some of this postvention stuff into practice? How can we be of service and assistance to those who are bereaved by suicide? And these are really kind of postvention guidelines. First and foremost, be empathic to the survivors. Being able to tell survivors that, I'm here and, I want to help. Creating a safe environment, avoid being judgmental. There, again, we've talked a lot about guilt, shame, and some of these really tough, negative emotional states that are pretty common among suicide bereaved. We want to make sure that they know they're not being judged. I stress big time, use the decedent's name. Tommy, Tammy, not he, or what did she do? It's not a she to someone who is close to that death. That is, your son, your daughter, use names as much as possible. When people tell me, obviously, as I told you at the outset, I work with a lot of veterans. When they say, oh, well, I had, a buddy of mine, offed himself. What was your buddy's name? I want to let's personalize that, because then it makes it more okay to talk about. And we can talk about, and one of the things we'll get to more is when we're working around postvention, it's really focusing on the entirety of the person's life. And it's so easy to get really myopic and focus only on the death. And so that's part of the healing process that we're going to talk about. You want to avoid debating if suicide is right or wrong. People have a lot of strong feelings about that. It is not your case to change anyone's opinion. It doesn't mean I have to agree with it, but that is not the time to get into philosophical debates. Avoid saying I understand. Yeah, understand. I mean, obviously you never tell someone, oh, well, I know what you're feeling, because we sure as hell don't know that. I really qualify a lot of my quote understanding comments. What I'm hearing is, or, I think I understand this. Can you tell me more? I really don't want to pigeonhole. And, when people are really sensitive, we got to be cautious to keep those doors open. So I would definitely agree that, steering clear of the understands, or understands a little bit different than I know, because I think it is important to convey a sense of understanding. I can say, I understand suicide loss. I don't understand your suicide loss. That's going to be your own personal trajectory. But yeah, I understand a lot about suicide and suicide deaths. That doesn't mean I know what you're going through. And so I think making that distinction is very important. So I really appreciate you throwing that in there, Norma. And then being aware of your own reactions to suicide. This is particularly important for those who are just coming into the field or have not been really immersed or worked a lot with suicide, suicidality, those bereaved by suicide. If you don't kind of know where suicide fits within your own personal beliefs and how you feel about it, we need to know what our reactions are, because we don't want to be projecting anything that's going to be even more distancing. Again, we're trying to be not non-judgmental. So we really want to go to kind of the four basics of disaster mental health, I think, because I find them quite applicable. And, the goals of disaster mental health are prevent psychological deterioration, We want to build resilience. We want to manage any acute symptoms. And then we want to return people to, at a minimum, their baseline level of functioning or their pre-trauma level of function. How are we doing on time? Doing well so far. Any questions on disaster mental health or this stuff? All right, I'm going to keep moving on then. That being said, fortunately, we have some good guidance and support for how to assist this very specific group of bereaved by suicide from people like John McIntosh, who I've mentioned several times, Jack Jordan, who edited that book with John. I always mispronounce their name. The Dirigraves are like the super couple of suicide bereavement research housed over at the University of Bergen in Norway. And they have really outlined a number of good tips for how to intervene. Safety and security first. I know in just my day-to-day clinical work, my patients get tired of me saying safety first, but I never deviate and I never apologize for it. And the same thing is going to apply when we're working in postvention. Safety and security first. This is particularly important if there is associated trauma. So we may have to teach grounding skills if depersonalization or flashbacks are occurring. You want to look at just some basics, and I don't think we talk enough about that as far as safety and security. You know, how is their housing? How is their food? How is their sleep? How can we just self-regulate? Trying to get that foundation in place. We want to keep as much consistency as we can, especially when the entire world is flipped upside down. You know, if there's things that we can do to kind of instill a sense of normalcy amongst this absolute chaotic storm of crap, that's really important. We want to look at dosing of the grief and learning skills for dosing grief, finding sanctuary, and cultivating what is sometimes referred to as psychic analgesia. And I love that term because I think it's cool. But the goal here is to modulate the person's intense psychic pain and allow them to gain some regulatory control over that pain so that it can be absorbed in manageable pieces. You know, we want to teach self-soothing activities. We're talking about meditation, massage, maybe exercise. Distraction and avoidance skills may be important. Recognizing and avoiding unnecessary triggers that can be associated with loss is very important. I'm not a big fan of avoidance as a long-term coping mechanism, but it's absolutely essential, especially in the aftermath of a major trauma. So we need to use it sparingly and appropriately. We want to cultivate positive affective experiences that produce relief and help people capture those. And what I mean by that is so often, you may relate to this if you've done work with people who've had a lot of depressive kind of episodes. It's just kind of that discounting of the positive. And here we're really trying to help those bereaved realize that it's okay and you can still have those experiences, even if they're really brief, of feeling good or not feeling crappy. I think that is a very common part of this process. And a lot of people feel guilty then for feeling good, because then it's like, oh, am I betraying my lost one? So it can pop in different ways. And we want to kind of alternate with the exposure skills that are necessary for confronting the loss. And this may be things like visiting the grave, looking at photographs or videos in this age of social media, going to kind of maybe the person's social media sites, and, you know, kind of balancing that with the distraction and avoidance. And so that alteration between those two really fits well with kind of that dual process model of grieving. For those of you who are interested in it, that's from Strobe and Schutt back in 1999. But it's kind of that dosing and working on avoidance at times, and then some more approach behaviors. We want to help in narrative creation. And this is kind of the creation of a complex, realistic, and yet still compassionate narrative of the suicide. And this can be accomplished through kind of a personal psychological autopsy. And the suicide can be described as kind of the perfect storm of crap all coalescing together. And this is, that convalescence of genetic factors, maybe means access, recent stressors, mental illness, but helping them kind of create a coherent narrative and story about why or how this maybe came about. It's helping that person form a story, and that helps them explain what's really the unexplainable. We are also going to work on helping kind of create and manage that search for meaning. Without, the goal is to avoid people falling too deeply into what has commonly been referred to, and I talk about, as the canyon of whys. Well, why this? Why? And why can be such a driving question for so many suicide loss survivors. And, at times it can just feel overwhelming because there are so many whys. And most survivors know little about what contributes to suicide. They tend to feel that the suicide could and should have been prevented if only someone had done something different. So we may need to conduct, a bit of a psychological autopsy to help kind of understand the state of mind maybe that the deceased was in, and piece together a narrative of why the suicide happened, what role various people, including themselves, may have played in that perfect storm of crap coming together in the suicide. The path to successful coping involves acquiring the capacity to hold complexity. And that's really being able to see the many different elements in this perfectly chaotic or destructive storm, and to realistically sort out what was and wasn't under the survivor's control, and to accept their limitations. We want to also teach and help people manage their social connections. We know that loss survivors, oh, very happy to be here, Rick. We know that survivors have to deal with what's been called the social incompetence of parts of their social networks. Survivors may sometimes encounter anger or blame or outright shunning from some people in their family or their broader community. We know that survivors may be the recipients of insensitive and intrusive comments from others. That's fairly common. Didn't you know they were depressed? That can seem really accusatory. Boy, what a selfish thing that person did. I mean, again, that's going to be perceived as very insensitive and intrusive, and helping kind of assist our survivors through that process and helping explain that, yeah, there are, it is an insensitive question, but how do we manage that when they do come up? More commonly, survivors encounter avoidance behaviors from other people due to what is called kind of social ambiguity. And these are avoidance behaviors that aren't necessarily the result of outright condemnation of the suicide or of the survivor, but it's more reflective of the awkwardness and confusion about how to appropriately interact with the survivor that a lot of people feel. In fact, going back to that phone call I talked about on that second slide today, not only did my dad call to reach out to the family, but my dad wanted me to get connected to the organization's leadership, because there were a lot of people in leadership who were like, all right, how can we be supportive of this person? And the first thing I said is, hey, let's not act like nothing happened, because and I know his world has flipped upside down, and there's been this major traumatic loss. And so that social ambiguity is very common. Think about the times when you've had interactions with other people and you didn't know really what to say, so you just didn't say a damn thing. That's really what this is talking about. You know, I really care about Kim and their family, but I don't know what to say about suicide, so I'm just gonna ask them if they need anything at the store and wave or go on about my day. When we look at other postvention targets, healing the relationship with the deceased. This is, the reality is that suicide almost always entails a rupturing of the relationship with the deceased. And research in grief has advanced over the last 2 decades by recognizing that many people continue to have a psychological relationship with their deceased loved one. And that's something I've really incorporated a lot into my practice and all of my grief work, essentially, not just suicide specific grief work, but grief in general, because it's a changing of the relationship. It isn't a termination of the relationship. When I've got a patient in my office and they're sharing with me about their loved one that they lost, they're sharing that relationship with me. And that keeps that relationship between them and their deceased loved one still present. It's different. And I don't minimize the fact that, yes, the relationship is totally different because one of the two of you is no longer here. But that doesn't mean the relationship is gone. And so that's really what this is talking about, is can we help heal the relationship with the deceased? The psychological healing work often needs to be accomplished between the mourner and their loved one after a suicide. And a skilled therapist might utilize things like guided imagery or guided exercises for disclosure, maybe some other kind of gestalt kind of work to help kind of facilitate that healing of the ruptured relationship. And then the last postvention target being memorialization of the deceased. And this can be more difficult after a suicide because it's a type of death that's often stigmatized, disenfranchised, and really experienced by a lot of mourners as a personal rejection, or it may be even a publicly dishonorable action. So a significant task can be finding ways to remember and honor the whole life of the deceased while putting the suicide in context. Any question on these 7 different kind of postvention targets? I know it seems like a lot, and obviously, the presentation is set up in a way that it's super fly all over the place for the first half, but this is really the work of postvention. And so that's why things slow down so much. I know there's a lot of writing on the screen. I hate that stuff because no one needs to do death by PowerPoint. That's why I use Prezi. I'll kill you a different way. That was funny. Questions on the postvention targets? I'm going to hang out and pause here for a second.
I'm waiting to see if we have any questions in the chat box. Some people are saying they don't have.
Well, I appreciate you chiming in, Nico. I mean, at least we know you're alive. Good job, dude.
I think one of the most important and one of the hardest ones for me is the healing the relationship with the deceased. I think I see a lot of individuals in the postvention situations that have a lot of issues with that part. So I think that was one of the most significant ones for me. This type of work to target.
And none of these are quick, easy treatment targets, and that's why, we can look at this can be a very prolonged kind of grief process. And in the postvention work, yes, you want to do a lot of the safety and security stuff in the immediate aftermath, but some of this stuff is going to take much longer, especially when we're looking at things like healing the relationship. right. So ultimately, the goal is to facilitate restoration of functioning and reinvestment in life. And the bereaved really may have a need to essentially relearn the world a bit. And that may have, been profoundly changed by the suicide. We want to assist the bereaved in finding meaning in their reconstituted life. So how do we really go about this? Well, we can think of this list as kind of a, how can you be an expert companion to the suicide bereaved? Because it's important to be present. And so we want to have good listening skills. And this is really practicing humility. And for some, it's a new way of listening without attempting to solve. And that can be really frustrating. I know at times I'm a fixer. I like fixing stuff. But this is listening with a very different focus, because it's listening in a way that allows change in ourselves. And it's not intent and driven on changing the other person or being an agent of change. We need to have knowledge. And this is really having a good basic knowledge and understanding about trauma and grief, realizing that I may not have many answers. And, when we think about that canyon of whys, I don't know why. And it's okay to say that, because I don't know much about this death or this situation. I know a lot about suicide. I know a lot about postvention, but I can't tell you why this suicide. There's a lot I can't tell you because I don't have that knowledge. No platitudes. This, I should have put it in bold with like fireworks going off all around it, because, oh, it'll get better. Oh, they're in a better place. Guess what? I've now been on the planet over half a century. I have yet to have a single person come back from the dead and tell me what it's like. So you can't tell me they're in a better place and have it be fact-based. And I don't go into the whole spirituality thing in religion. That's for everyone gets to make their own call on that. But all I say is, guess what? That's a platitude. I can't tell anyone that stuff. I can tell them it hurts because I see the hurt. We need to recognize their supports. Recognizing that others may not be there for the long haul is really important. And we see this in a lot of deaths, especially within Western culture. We're great at, oh my God, a family member died, so there's a food train for the next month. There's this massive outpouring, everyone shows up, and then 3 weeks later, it's like, well, what the hell? Aren't you fine yet? I mean, you got plenty of food and we're all back to normal, so you must be too. Doesn't happen that way. So I think what's important, especially in kind of the immediate aftermath, when we're looking at that safety and security, once I know that that's established, and especially as a professional, I want them to rely heavily on their own personal social support during this time. And I want them to recognize and use their supports, but I also want them to know that I'm here for the long haul. And then once those kind of natural social supports fall off from their life, I can be there to help kind of prop them up and hopefully work on that continued growth. So we want to stay present and accessible, and we want to pass on what we've learned from others. That's how we acquire our own expertise, and that's what you will learn, continue to cultivate and grow. We want to demonstrate qualities of good companionship. We want to be sensitive, courageous in not talking around subjects, courageous in being able to sit with someone in that much pain, because that can be really hard. and accepting of them. And we've talked a lot about being aware and of the limits and the ambiguity around the suicide death. We know that the development of expertise is really, according to the research, it's based on, do you know the research? Yes, but also what we've learned from our own interactions, our own work with others who've been impacted by suicide. We know that trauma survivors often must really re-understand everything, but within that process, we can actually, in many cases, facilitate areas of post-traumatic growth. And that's what that working towards PTG is all about. You know, it's really a process of seeking, finding, reminding, and constructing benefits for oneself and others, and then working towards establishing and maintaining a future orientation that may include some altered priorities. And then we're going to construct some meaning out of that, hopefully. And then as part of that entire process, we end up creating a new coherent narrative. And for a lot of people, that turns into missions that, you know, can transform loss into something good. That's not an uncommon process. You know, I think there's particular ways that we can help facilitate post-traumatic growth. One of them is to just notice evolving domains of growth. It is so powerful to be in a room and say, you know, I've noticed something new in you that, you know, I think you tend to overlook in yourself, or maybe helping people understand, oh, there are these strengths that I may not see in myself, but you, as being a good companion, may be able to highlight for them. And, you know, let's also use the person's experience. We all learn and grow through our own pain, trauma, loss, and so have they. What can we apply from their previous losses or their previous traumas? How did you get through that? How can we translate some of those skills and processes into the present? So as we think about kind of working with those bereaved by suicide, we also need to understand that, you know, for some people, they may never have closure, and that is okay, and that those suffering loss continue to be attached to the decedent. Actually, before I go to that, I also want to highlight that, you know, we can also look, we're very talk-based, especially in mental health. And so people can grieve in different ways, but they can also heal in different ways. And so maybe we need to also explore, you know, alternatives to talk, other ways that people may be expressing their grief and or their growth. And, you know, actions in many cases are a proxy way for talk. This is not uncommon, especially in men, but we see it in different groups, different cultures as well. So all of our focus so far has been pretty much on the individual loss survivor. How many of you are familiar with suicide survivor or suicide loss groups, suicide bereavement groups? This is where you get to type or nod or unmute. Oh, thank you, Paula. Glad someone's out there. Thought I was talking to myself again.
I am glad that at least some people are saying they're familiar, because we do have suicide bereavement groups. We have the Florida Initiative for Suicide Prevention, which is ran through our Mental Health America organization, and they have suicide support groups for survivors and family members. And we recently awarded Mental Health America the contract to launch a loss team.
Great. Oh, Don't worry, we're going to talk about them here in a second.
So
And I knew that you guys were working on that, so I didn't put a whole lot of work into that slide because you're going to get a lot of great loss
it's
stuff.
coming. So I'm glad.
Loss is awesome. All right, so let's talk about groups here for just a couple minutes. There are some potential benefits of groups. Obviously, it helps counter isolation. It can provide more of that safe environment when, I've worked with so many suicide loss survivors, and they don't feel comfortable in general talking about the suicide loss itself with people in general. And it is so comforting for them to be in a room of people who have been through that social ambiguity that we talked about, and that social avoidance in friends and work communities, because these are people who are also getting some of that same reaction from their own peer groups. So it provides a nice, safe environment, hopefully. Going to be helpful in teaching them kind of how others have navigated. We get to learn how to trust people again. And that's really important. And it's so essential to have role models. Think about how important role models and just being able to see it, to be it, that we have to incorporate into our own lives. Well, we also want to translate that into this group of people. Certainly empowering and hopefully inspires hope. And it's a way to create new friends. We know that for some people, they do feel some of that social ostracization. So it's really critical to get connected to a new social group with whom they can be embraced. You'll notice there's a couple different organizations listed up here. Oh my gosh, that didn't work the way it was supposed to. All right, well, we're still going to hang out and we're going to talk about these. All right, so I never know what's going on with my slides, apparently. Obviously, you've heard me talk a lot about the American Association of Suicidology. They have some great group resources. And the reason I've listed all three of these is because you can find listings on loss survivor groups through each of these three organizations: the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, the American Association of Suicidology, as well as Suicide Awareness Voices of Education. I know that through these sites, I quickly located more than 10 posted loss survivor groups between Juniper and Miami. So it's just a really nice go-to resource on, hey, how do I get connected to a group? I can't speak to how good a group it is, how cohesive it is, how large or small, but it's nice to know that we have those national resources that can get you connected to a group wherever. And regardless of the setting in which you provide help to suicide loss survivors, we need to keep in mind the importance of using your database and making sure that we reach out to those bereaved by suicide during particularly difficult periods of time. I think some of these are really kind of common sense. Obviously, it's now December, so yes, holidays are hard for a lot of suicide survivors, but we also need to include other important dates, such as the decedent's date of birth. Birthdays are something we want to be aware of, as well as the date of their death. Anniversaries of those deaths are really hard for a lot of people. And, we can really take and apply what we've learned from suicide prevention and intervention and the use of caring contacts and apply that to postvention. Let's make sure that we send out, just a caring postcard the month of a lost survivor's loss, saying, hey, I know that, we're coming up on the anniversary of Tim's death or whatever. Wanted to remind you, we're here for you. I know it can be a hard time. That's all you got to send. But that conveys so much, and we really want to facilitate that. I also, and I don't have a slide for them, if you're ever working with veterans or active duty who have died by suicide, TAPS is a great organization, the Tragedy Assistance and Tragedy Assistance. they would kill me for blanking on the P. I'm really hoping someone will type that in the chat box so I don't feel like an idiot. You guys are not helping me at all. Tragedy assistance. I can see the logo and everything. TAPS is good. That's what I'll leave it at that. All right, so some additional resources. As Aisha was just talking about, yay for lost teams. This is actually Dr. Frank Campbell. He's a friend of mine. He's a fellow past president of AAS. And it was really due to his more than 20 years working with those bereaved by suicide. It is Program for Survivors. I wanted to back away from P. Thank you so much. Doggone it. All right, so Frank is awesome. And he worked through the Baton Rouge Crisis Intervention Center, which he helped create. He really developed an active postvention model that is most commonly known as the LOST team, and that stands for Local Outreach to Suicide Survivors. The active postvention model concept really involves a team of first responders, typically referred to as a LOST team, and they go out to the scene of a suicide and provide support and referral for those bereaved by the suicide. As you can see here on the slide, the goal of the active postvention model has been to shorten the elapsed time between the death and survivors finding the help that they will feel will help them cope with the devastating loss. The active postvention model has been shown to have a positive impact on both team members, which are most often bereaved individuals who have gotten help and now provide the installation of hope to the newly bereaved, as well as the newly bereaved. Loss consists of a mental health professional, trained survivor volunteer, who go with the police or ME to visit newly bereaved families on the day of the death, often at the scene. There's empirical evidence now that shows survivors who are paired with a lost team tend to enter treatment within months to a year after the loss, and this is dramatically different compared to the average of several years for those who have not had contact with such resources. The lost team model is being used now in countries as diverse as Australia, Singapore, Northern Ireland, Canada, as well as the US. How are we doing on time? Oh, we're gonna get through a couple slides and then we're gonna hang out and chat because that's the important part. That's the part I love. All right, so back to the resources. A couple great internet resources. I've talked a lot about AAS, the American Association of Suicidology. They have a whole suicide loss survivor division. Lots of great resources on their website, suicidology.org. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, AFSP.org. Awesome group, funds a lot of really cool research, not only for suicide intervention and prevention, but they also work a lot with survivors. The Suicide Prevention Resource Center, hopefully that is a resource you've accessed and utilized yourselves. It really contains a wealth of resources for suicide prevention and postvention. And then I really like the Now Matters Now. This is more intervention based, but the site was developed by Dr. Ursula Whiteside. And it provides links to crisis lines and videos and provides good DBT-based skills. And I'm gonna run through a couple books real quick. This is Touched by Suicide, Hope and Healing. This is an awesome book written by a survivor, Carla Fine, whose husband was a dentist and died by suicide, and a psychiatrist, Dr. Michael Myers, and they do such a great job really looking at all the different ways that suicide can impact an individual. And you get both Carla's personal survivor experience, but you also get Dr. Myers' great input on what the professional angle is to those same questions. But I Didn't Say Goodbye, Helping Families After a Suicide is a good book by Barbara Rubel. It's a nice practical resource. And this is actually a PDF. It's an open access document from the UK. It's actually where that quote came from earlier about the lost survivor who was explaining what their experience was. Now, I've kind of rushed through these last couple slides because I wanted to make sure we had plenty of time to talk. But if you have any questions after today, and I will hang out from now until you guys get tired of talking to me or tired of hearing me. But this is question and answer time, but feel free to shoot me an email. You can look at me on Facebook or message me on Facebook. I technically have Twitter and Instagram. I don't know how either one of those damn things work. So by all means, find me there. I don't know what the hell to do with it, but it sounds cool and it makes me professional-ish, I guess. And make sure you complete the training survey at the following link in the chat box. All right, so now let's kind of sit back and let's just talk. Thoughts, reactions, comments.
So we'd like to open this up to the participants at this time. If you would like to unmute and share any of your thoughts about anything from the session, or if you'd like to put any thoughts in the chat box. I see a lot of thank yous coming through. Somebody said it was interested in learning about the history of the perception of suicide. And I did appreciate how you went through the different historical perspectives as well, from not only the religious aspect, but the cultural, the Romans and the Greek aspect of from martyrdom to it being considered a sin. We do have a high school called St. Thomas Aquinas here, and so I'm familiar with that Catholic concept, having gone to a Catholic school myself, and I remember being taught by nuns. It was considered the ultimate sin because you didn't get a chance to ask for forgiveness before your death.
Yeah. And, you know, I will tell you, I am a psychologist, so I use whatever I can in a moment. If someone's belief in that is a protective factor and it keeps them living, then I will reinforce the hell out of it. That I won't reinforce it. I will say, I mean, I'm glad that, you know, they are going to stay here. And if that's part of what keeps them here, I'm all for it. But I also, we are working more and more with the faith communities because we're really trying to change some of the narrative around. And most faith communities are getting much better about that. In fact, I've got a priest over here in Louisiana who lost a fellow priest to suicide a year ago. And so that really, talk about shifting your spiritual foundation and having to kind of work through that. That was a really powerful process for him.
Yeah, it's a hard one. But the use of the loss teams, I think, is so imperative because the support that people need afterwards. I think we don't think a lot about the exposure to suicide increasing the risk for those who have been so affected.
And the data that Frank has collected is so convincing because he was looking just at the data for the Baton Rouge Crisis Intervention Center, and I don't want to misrepresent him, but I want to say that, you know, over the years they tracked it and they found prior to when they had the loss team, it took survivors on average like 10 years after the death to make it to their first loss survivor group. But when they implemented the loss team, that was months to a year.
So that intervention was a lot more immediate.
So it saved 9 years of kind of hanging out, you know, not knowing where to go. Now, I also think part of that is due to we are getting a little bit better about talking about suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention. So hopefully that's part of the shifting dialogue and zeitgeist.
Shannon says, thank you for the lesson in the practice of postvention and the targets. And oh, it's always a relief to hear patients say their faith in God prevents them from suicide. Um, I agree with you. That was always like a protective factor I latched onto because I was like, oh, there's something that's some internal motivation that will stop them in ways I can't necessarily stop them. So I agree with that as well. But
And we also want to remember, protective factors are great, but it doesn't ensure
mhm.
safety. And so we really want it. And we know that those who have been impacted by suicide are at higher risk. So we definitely want to be attuned to not only their acute needs, but kind of their more long-term needs also.
Actually, that part of your workshop was something that I have tried to change my mentality about, because I remember doing biopsychosocial and asking people about family history of suicide and getting a no answer. So, in decreasing their risk in my head.
Mhm.
And so that concept of shifting family history to any impact is so important, because I remember working on the, psych unit and being ready to discharge a client, and the day of discharge, a schoolmate died by suicide. And we had to change the whole discharge plan because we're like,
Yeah.
nope, this is somebody that was way closer to her than a family member
Exactly.
history. So,
And it's amazing how many, when I do my suicide risk assessments with people, when I'm doing more intervention work, part of my suicide risk assessment is, has your life been impacted by suicide? Because I want to know if they're a lost survivor. And then I ask, how did that impact you? It may be a second cousin, but he was like my brother growing up. Well, that's very different. I also had one person who said, I had a boss, and I didn't work with him a whole lot because he was a low level employee and the boss was way up there, but that boss's suicide had a huge impact on him. That's not something that you will pick up in a family history. And so we really want to be able to kind of look at these in slightly different ways.
and especially not only just the people around them, but the celebrity exposure. When I started shifting my questioning, um, you talked about aging yourself, and I was like, I must be in the same age range too, because Robin Williams was very impactful for me. Um, Anthony Bourdain, Kate Spade. I remember having an increase in clients really talking about how those impacted them, because they were people that they idolized and they considered having it all together. And they're like, if I remember one client said to me about Robin Williams in general, if he doesn't have it all together, then how can I pretend to?
Yeah.
And so that was something that really impacted me, to recognize how these global popular figures can really, people can feel so personally connected to them in their life.
Very much so. Very much so.
I like that you mentioned that. Thank you so much.
I love hanging out with you guys. I wish you guys had more questions, but I'm not going anywhere. I will outwait you.
I will, I'm gonna leave us up while I share my screen. I am hoping that you are seeing a PowerPoint now, everybody.
Dr. Schmitz, I'm sorry. We would love, you mentioned, Aisha mentioned that we are so proud to be, incorporating a loss team here in Broward through United Way. We would love for Mental Health America and the leadership there to get access to some of Dr. Campbell's data as we start that process and help them, assist them with that. Can you, maybe if I reach out at some point, can share with me how I can access that data for them?
Yeah, you can actually go to his website. I want to say it's lostteam.org. But just type in Frank Campbell Lost Team. It'll take you right to the homepage, and it gives you all the information. It's got his contact information.